Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day. So this lecture video is intended to be watched after you've taken exam 1. So remember that exam 1 is going to close at noon, 12 p.m. on February 3rd. So if you have questions about your grades or about exam 1, please feel free to email me. I will be going in after the exam closes and putting in those extra points for the opinion questions. So I have to set a right answer for the opinion questions because Canvas doesn't let me do opinion questions, which means if you clicked on the answer that was marked the right answer, you got those points immediately. But for other students who clicked on a different answer, then you wouldn't get those points immediately, but you will get those points after the exam closes. So I say all that to say that your grade may go up a little bit after that exam closes. Now, if you have questions about exam 1, please let me know. Remember that you do get a drop grade for exams. So if exam 1 didn't go the way you had hoped, it's not the time to panic, but might be a time to course correct, make some adjustments. So today we're going to be starting the material for exam 2. So this is going to be a relatively short section. We're only going to have 3 lecture videos in this section. And today's lecture video is going to finish up the information on infancy by talking about social development in infancy. And then we'll move on to talking about later childhood after that. So you will have an activity that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m. Let me know if you have any questions about that. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get into lecture. Alright, so as I said, today we're going to be talking about socio-emotional development in infancy and early childhood. So we've already talked a little bit during the material for exam 1 about biological, physical development as well as cognitive development in infancy and early childhood. Today we're going to focus on the relationships that very young children have, and of course those relationships in those first few years primarily focus around parents. Although other relationships, peer relationships, siblings, other family members are important as well, we know the importance of parenting during those first few years of life. So when we talk about parenting, the classical research on parenting comes from Baumrin, and Baumrin identified 4 basic types of parenting. And you'll see them listed here. These 4 types are made up of high and low levels of affection and discipline. So Baumrin would say that the 2 most important dimensions of parenting are affection and love, unconditional acceptance of children, and discipline, providing structure, rules that are fair, following through with those rules, and being able to discuss those rules with children. So we end up with 4 parenting styles that you see listed here. Authoritative parenting is high on both, so high on affection and high on discipline. And the research says that this is the best type of parenting almost across the board. When you see research on parenting, you're going to see the better outcomes associated with authoritative parenting. Now, one thing to say is that I do say associated with. This research is correlational in nature because we can't randomly assign certain parents to certain parenting styles. We can't say you have to be a neglectful parent because you ended up in this group. So this is correlational in nature, which means we cannot determine causation. However, there is a lot of research to suggest there's a very important connection between parenting and outcomes in children. So authoritative parenting that's high on affection and high on discipline is the best type of parenting, pretty much. After that, you have 3 other types of parenting that are associated with different negative outcomes. Authoritarian parenting, now don't get these 2 confused. Authoritative is ideal. Authoritarian is a little bit more like a dictator. So this is going to be high on discipline and structure, but low on affection and warmth. So this is the you're supposed to be seen and not heard, overly harsh style of parenting, where the structure is there, the rules are there, but love and affection is not. And we see this related to things like anxiety disorders, communication difficulties. This increases risks in kids. But then another type of parenting is permissive parenting. Permissive parenting is the opposite or the flip side of authoritarian. So permissive parenting is going to be high on affection and low on discipline. So this would be the parent that is the best friend, the one that wants to be the cool parent perhaps, and the one that is maybe loving and affectionate but doesn't provide much structure. Now, this is also not ideal. Structure is protective of kids, and children need that structure to be put in place for them. So kids that have received permissive parenting tend to be at risk for things like school issues, self-control problems, substance use, that kind of thing. And then finally, neglectful parenting is going to be low on affection and low on discipline. So these are parents that are basically uninvolved in their kids' lives. And of course, there is pretty much a very wide range of problems associated with neglectful parenting. So the parenting styles issue is going to come back up as we go through the lifespan. We're going to talk about this more when we talk about middle childhood. But suffice it to say that the parenting that someone receives is very important for their outcomes later on. And that's why I ask you to think about it for your Activity 4. So Activity 4 asks, what kind of parenting do you think is going on most in our culture? And I want you to think about how this impacts society at large. So if the majority of a culture is parenting a certain way, and if parenting a certain way is associated with certain outcomes, then this will definitely impact our culture at large. Now, there are a couple of different ways you could take this, and I've kind of left it open-ended. You could talk about parenting in America, kind of general in our individualistic culture, or you could talk about parenting specifically in the South or parenting specifically in Mississippi. There is a stereotype of authoritarian parenting being more common in the South, of the kind of harsher, more expectations of kids, more of the structure and the rules, maybe less of the affection. So there's a stereotype of that. But you can talk about our particular region, or you can talk about the culture at large. That's fine as well. So I look forward to reading your thoughts on parenting. Obviously, that is crucial for future development. So as we're talking about social development, it mentions Erikson here. We've had an overview of Erikson when we talked about our theorists. Erikson had this view that you go through the psychosocial stages, and that in each stage there's going to be a problem that you need to solve. There's going to be something that we need to learn, and that if you are able to get through that stage successfully, then you bring resilience, you bring strength with you. But if you're not able to resolve these conflicts here, then you bring some kind of issue that may linger later in life. So it mentions a few of these that might be happening during early childhood. So Erikson's first stage here about basic trust versus mistrust. So thinking about the first year of life, everything that a child receives happens from a parent, comes from a parent. There's no way that a child can take care of any of their basic needs on their own. So being able to be fed and cleaned and have their diaper changed and dressed and kept warm and comforted and loved, that's something that babies need. And so the idea is that if consistent parenting is there, consistent care, then babies will learn that they can trust their caregivers. They know that when they cry, which is a baby's way of signaling mom and dad before they can communicate any other way, when they cry, their caregiver will come and meet their needs. On the other hand, we have some infants, unfortunately, that are neglected or not cared for, that have learned that when they cry, their needs will not be met. And so you think about, for example, in an orphanage situation where there are more children than there are caregivers, substantially, then there might be babies there that stop crying because they have cried and their needs have unfortunately not been met. That does not happen just in orphanage situations either. So the idea is that we want infants to learn that they can trust their caregivers. Now, we move on from there as babies get a little bit older, and they have this autonomy issue versus shame and doubt. So when we're talking about autonomy, we're talking about some independence here. And if you've been around kids that are 2, 3 years old, they're starting to want some independence. So during this time, kids want to be able to make some decisions on their own, and they want to feel like they are capable of doing that. And so it is important for parents to give kids some options within the realm of reality here. So we might say, okay, well, you can either have this or this for dinner. Which one of these do you want? Of course, you can't let kids choose what they're going to eat because they're always going to choose things that are unhealthy, right? Unfortunately, sometimes I shouldn't be allowed to choose what I'm going to eat, but that's a whole other conversation. The idea is that kids need to know that they can make choices and that they can be independent. And the concern is that if they are constantly being told what to do, and it's almost as if their view doesn't matter, then they can start to experience that shame and start to doubt themselves, and that can cause issues. And then as they move closer to kind of preschool ages, it talks about initiative versus guilt. So kids wanting to be able to explore their social world, wanting to be able to develop relationships with peers, and they want to be able to initiate those new relationships and to experience new things. And sometimes it is kind of a reaction parents might have of wanting to, like, I want to protect my kids, I want to keep them safe, I want to put them in a bubble. I completely understand. I have often wondered if I can bubble wrap my kids, but it is important to let kids have a little bit of freedom, let them have a little bit of initiative so that they learn how to cooperate with others. So we talked about parenting being important during this, of course parenting is always important, but during this age range of infancy and early childhood. So then when we talk about parenting, we think about the differences perhaps between relationships with fathers and relationships with mothers. So one thing that we do see is that part of this is cultural, and that this is changing a little bit. Parents in general may be a little bit more involved these days than they have been at certain time periods, especially fathers. Although I think there's a rise of mothers working outside of the home, but there is also a rise in fathers that are spending more time with their kids and being more involved with their kids. Nevertheless, it says that a child's attachment to their father tends to develop later. So usually the closest attachment is with mom early on. And you can see why this is. When a baby is born, they recognize their mother's voice, they recognize their mother's smell. Oftentimes, if mom is breastfeeding, then you think about mom being a source of food, but whether she's breastfeeding or not, mom is a source of comfort. And so usually the baby does bond with dad, but it might take a little bit longer to do that. It talks about fathers spending more time playing with their kids. So when you do research on the ways that fathers interact with their kids, we see that mothers tend to be a little bit more involved in the specific nurturing or giving the baby a bath or changing the diapers and that kind of thing. And dads might do a little bit more play, which can create this unfortunate cycle where the mom is doing the things that are unpleasant. Like, mom is going to come over here and make me eat green beans, whereas dad's going to play games with me. And so that can be unfortunate. We also see, though, that mothers tend to read more to children and talk more to them. And this may be something that comes naturally to mothers a little bit more than fathers. We're going to talk later about how we do see that women tend to score a little bit higher on verbal tasks, on intelligence tests, which may be because in our society we emphasize talking more among women than we do among men, perhaps. But it talks about children seeking out their dad for a playmate and mothers for comfort. One thing to note here, though, is that this is kind of general information. Certainly this would depend on the situation. Some kids may seek out dad for comfort, may seek out mom for playmate. It depends on your unique situation and your relationship, what kind of mother you had, what kind of father you had, but this is what we typically see. Now, if we're studying parenting and the relationship that a parent has with their child, then we need to talk about attachment styles. And so this research is going to be looking at the way that a child attaches to their parent, which will then impact the way they attach to other people later in life. Now, once again, this is correlational in nature. So there are correlations between certain attachment styles and certain relationship outcomes. But just because you have, if you were to happen to have a less than ideal attachment style, that does not mean that you can't go on to have successful relationships. Your attachment style can change over time. You might have had bad experiences early on in life, but then later on you have healthy relationships and your attachment style can become secure. So I don't want anyone to feel like just because maybe you're not secure right now, that means you'll never be secure. That's not the case. But what we see is that there are 4 main attachment styles that research has supported, one of which is secure attachment, which is the one that we want, and then we'll talk about the other 3 types in a second. But the way they do this research is they'll bring in caregiver and child, which usually this research is done with mothers. So bring in mother and child into a laboratory setting that has toys, and then would also have lab assistants, other people working there to keep an eye on the kids. So we're not leaving these kids unsupervised. There will be somebody in the room with them. And then the idea is that they'll play for a little while, then mom will leave for a bit and then come right back. So then we look to see how the child will react. And the way that the child reacts to mom leaving and mom coming back will tell us a lot about the way that the child is attached to mom. So first of all, secure attachment, which is obviously the one that we want. This is an ideal type of attachment. So a child may develop a secure attachment here, and you'll see this, that the child will perhaps be upset when mom leaves, but probably not extremely upset, and child may calm down a little bit, and then when mom comes back, child will want to go see mom and will be happy to see mom. So this is common for kids the first few times they get left at a babysitter or grandma's house or go to preschool. They may be a little bit upset, but then they'll calm down. If they're securely attached, they'll calm down and they'll be excited when mom comes back. Like, yay, I'm so glad to see mom. The thought is that they've received consistent parenting, and therefore they know that mom loves me and mom will come back. And even if I'm a little bit upset, I can trust mom to come back. And then when mom does come back, they'll be really happy to see mom. Now, this is indicative of someone who is comfortable with close relationships, comfortable with intimacy, and adults who have secure attachment styles are more likely to have healthy, happy relationships. Now, whenever I look at this number, it always surprises me that we see 60 to 65% of people having secure attachment styles. With a 50% divorce rate, which if you didn't already know that, let that sink in for a second. A 50% divorce rate in our culture, and yet 60% of people are securely attached. It makes you wonder how that happens. But more on marriage later. We're still in infancy and early childhood, so I'm skipping ahead a little bit. All right. Then we have 3 types of attachment that we would classify as insecure. So first one of those would be avoidant attachment. Now, avoidant attachment happens when usually the child has been neglected. Now, once again, this is correlational, and you can develop an avoidant attachment even if you've not been neglected, but this is more associated with neglectful parenting. What tends to happen is that mom will leave the room, and the child will be like, fine, I don't care. Go on. That's fine. Go away. And then when mom comes back, they're like, I don't care that you're here. So basically, they are keeping mom at arm's length, keeping mom at a distance. Come or go, I don't care. Now, think about this then. Someone who has an avoidant attachment style as an adult might then be uncomfortable in close relationships. That kind of, you can go, you can stay, I don't care. Maybe someone who's afraid of commitment, that kind of thing. Couple of other options here. You'll see it referred to here as resistant attachment, but it can also be called anxious ambivalent attachment, so make sure you know both terms. Anxious ambivalent is another term for this attachment style, but anxious ambivalent or resistant attachment, this is the clingy, needy kind of attachment. This is where the child becomes very upset when mom leaves, and then when mom comes back, child will then go cling to mom, crying, you left me, why did you leave me, I thought you weren't going to come back, very upset. Now, what we see is that this is often associated with inconsistent parenting. So maybe sometimes we are more authoritative and then sometimes we're not. And so someone who's received that inconsistent parenting maybe doesn't feel safe, like they're not sure what to expect. Sometimes I feel comfortable and sometimes I don't. I don't know if you're going to come back. And so they might then be very upset because they're not really sure what's going to happen here. So then someone who has an anxious, ambivalent, or resistant attachment style as an adult is likely to be that, okay, please tell me you love me, constantly needing reassurance, clingy, that kind of thing. And then finally, it talks about a disorganized attachment style here. This is the least common of the 4, and it happens oftentimes when someone's received kind of a wide range of treatment and maybe kind of confused. And so it talks about the separation and return confuse the baby. So maybe responding in ways that don't really make sense, or kind of a strange combination of the other types. And so basically they don't fit well into any of the other categories, and so we put them in this disorganized category. So obviously we want children to be securely attached, and so one of the best ways to produce a secure attachment is just to be authoritative in your parenting, to be loving and consistent in your parenting. So we do see environmental instability and stress can be an issue here. And this is then a question, are we stressing kids out too much with the way that our educational system is set up, with all of the after-school things, all the things that they're involved in, conflict in the home, all these things can potentially be stressful for kids. So wanting to make sure that kids feel safe, because early secure attachment does then predict
successful outcomes later. Once again, this is correlational. Some people may receive the best parenting in the world and then later go on to have a bad experience and become insecure in their attachment. But we do see this relationship where you're more likely to be successful if you've had secure attachment styles. On the other hand, as I've kind of gone through and talked about these, there are some relationship issues that can come up with the other attachment styles. It talks specifically about that disorganized attachment, kind of confused all over the place, being associated with things like anxiety, anger, aggression. So parenting is huge. Attachment is huge during those early years of parenting. And I do wonder and worry a little bit if we're not overly individualistic in our culture, and if we don't maybe we don't always respond to children the way that we should because we're concerned about creating this independence in kids, that potentially we could be creating some attachment issues by kind of separating them a little bit too much at too early of an age. So what determines the quality of attachment? A lot of different things. And it's very difficult to predict exactly what attachment style that a child will have, because it's not just the parenting you receive, but it's also the temperament. So as I said, predictable, which means consistent, basically. Sensitive, responsive parenting. So babies don't manipulate you. They cry because they need something. So having their needs met, very important. But it also talks here about temperament. And temperament is kind of a precursor to personality. We're talking about some children are a little bit high maintenance. Some children are a little bit more laid back, and that is something that is at least partly biological and is something that is there from birth. So temperament is something that does then interact with parenting. So some kids are just easier to parent. I'm sure you know, even if you don't have kids, you know that some kids are just easier to parent or easier to care for than other kids. So temperament does play a role. But it talks here about parental training. So we do have something like parent management training, where we can teach parents about how to discipline appropriately, how to set rules and follow through with those rules. And that can help parents to spend more time with their kids, to interact more positively with their kids, and then perhaps improve their quality of their relationship. So something to think about. Also, when we're talking about socio-emotional development, obviously emotions are huge here. And it talks here about emotions having a functional value, that emotions can help us navigate our relationships. And so we're going to be talking about emotions as they develop during infancy and early childhood. And then we're going to be carrying on with this theme. So talking about biological development, cognitive development, socio-emotional development, for really all of the life stages, and we're going to carry on talking about this. So this information is going to come back up as we talk about older individuals as well. But starting off with emotions in infants and very young children, we then have to differentiate between complex and basic emotions. So basic emotions are the ones that are going to develop first. And when you think about basic emotions, it makes me think about the movie Inside Out. I don't know if you guys have seen. It was a pretty good movie. There was some psychological references there. The idea that you have things like joy, sadness, anger, fear, distress, disgust, interest, surprise. These are all very basic emotions that you have from early on. Very young babies, I mean newborns, can show joy and sadness a little bit, right? And so it involves basically a subjective feeling, which when we're talking about very young children, they may not be able to verbalize that. But you can pick up on their feelings from their behaviors. And then it talks about physiological change. So something like their breathing, for example, are they hyperventilating, or are they breathing normally? That kind of thing. Maybe your pulse, you see when you're angry, your pulse rate goes up, that kind of thing. So it's a combination of the way you feel, what your body is doing, your overt behavior. Overt just means everyone can see it. Now, how do we study these emotions in children that are not yet old enough to verbalize their emotions? Well, oftentimes we're looking at things like facial expressions and their behaviors to try to help us understand the way that they are feeling in a particular situation. And parents often say they feel like they're able to understand their kids' emotions because they spend a lot of time with them. They know that maybe this particular situation triggers anger. Like, for example, feeding my kids green beans. Never made them happy. Although my youngest eats green beans, but my first two did not. All right. Basic emotions here. Newborns are capable of pleasure and distress. And it's pretty obvious what they're feeling at a particular moment. Now, what makes a newborn happy? Oftentimes things like being held by their caregivers, or maybe certain noises that they like listening to, a white noise machine, that kind of thing, that sounds kind of similar to the sounds they heard in the womb. Feeding, obviously, they enjoy eating. Distress can come from pain. It can come from a wet diaper. It can come from being held by someone that you're not comfortable with, that kind of thing. And then as they get older, they start to show more emotions, things like sadness and smiles. So babies will start smiling. There's a pretty wide range of when that first smile happens, and it's considered normal for there to be some variation there, but it talks about 2 to 3 months is where you might see social smiles. Baby might smile before then, but a social smile means they're smiling because they see someone else smiling or kind of responding to someone else. And this can be accompanied by cooing, which are those vowel sounds, that kind of like ooh sounds that babies make. And so they're happy to see faces, especially faces that they recognize, that they see a pretty good bit. And then as they get older, it talks about 4 to 6 months, anger, and it talks about frustration. Frustration happens when we feel like something has prevented us from achieving our goal. And so during this time, infants become more aware of the world around them and potentially start being more mobile. So babies will roll over and start crawling to try to get to something that they want. And if you take that thing away from them, they can get very angry. They can get very frustrated with you. And that's because you have prevented them from reaching their goal. I really wanted to put that in my mouth, and it seemed like that was something I should be allowed to have, right? Mom is like totally unfair, but whole nother conversation. All right. Something else that's happening with their emotions, stranger wariness. So usually around 6 months, although there is a wide range of normal here, and some kids will experience this more than others, kids will start to be a little nervous of other people. Now, if you have a secure attachment, then you may be a little bit less nervous. Like, I trust mom or dad, both. I trust my caregivers, and so I feel comfortable maybe being around other people as long as mom and dad are there. But it makes sense because babies are starting to crawl, they're starting to roll, and so it would be adaptive for them to stay with people who they're safe with instead of wandering off with strangers, that kind of thing. Now, stranger wariness is sometimes, maybe you're thinking that's a good thing. You know, we want our babies to want to be with us and not to be with other people that maybe they shouldn't be with. You know, think about protecting your kids, and that is good. What you should know, though, is that oftentimes this kind of goes away as they get a little bit older, but this does depend, a great deal depends on temperament. Some kids are just more friendly than others, and so something you have to keep in mind, got to keep kids safe. Disgust is also important here for protecting kids because they need to avoid things that could make them sick. They don't want to put everything in their mouth. So the 6-month-old that can actively crawl, and not everyone can crawl at 6 months, but if you're a 6-month-old and you can roll and crawl a little bit, you need to be cautious with what you put in your mouth. And so disgust is something that is intended to be protective to keep us from eating something that we shouldn't eat. Now, those are basic emotions, but then complex emotions develop later. It talks about things like guilt, embarrassment, and pride. So a complex emotion is one that you can't really develop until you understand a little bit about who you are and the culture that you live in. So, for example, you can't feel embarrassed unless you know that other people have expectations of you and that you have not met those expectations. Or you feel pride when you understand that other people have expectations of you and you have met those expectations. So, very young children don't feel embarrassment. Now, they'll run around naked and they don't care. As they get older, though, they start to understand the social norms of what is expected, and then they can feel good when they meet those norms, and they can start to feel bad when they don't. So it talks about your understanding of yourself can develop perhaps as early as 15 to 18 months, and although that's going to be a very basic understanding of who you are. It's going to become more complex as you get older. And so these emotions start to emerge at 18 to 24 months, but they'll be continuously emerging as you get older and understand the culture around you more. But one thing to note then is that things like guilt, embarrassment, and pride differ from culture to culture. The way you express them and the situations in which you feel them depend a lot on what you've been taught. So it talks about basic and complex emotions may be expressed similarly, especially with basic emotions. So the things like happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, you don't have to know a person to be able to read those facial expressions. You don't even have to know the culture they're from. Happy looks like happy pretty similarly across the world. Complex emotions may or may not be expressed similarly. You may see different facial expressions, different body language, different ways of responding to those more complex emotions in different cultures. So basic emotions are pretty universal. The more complex emotions differ a lot based on culture. It has a couple of examples here. So when we're thinking about individualistic culture that's focused on ourselves, we tend to think about European cultures or American cultures, kind of Western cultures. When we talk about collectivist cultures, we're often thinking about maybe more Eastern cultures, like Asian cultures, for example, would be the classic example of collectivist cultures. So children who are raised in collectivist cultures are more likely to show emotional restraint. So then maybe whether or not they're feeling the same amount of emotion is a different issue, but they're not showing as much emotion. In our culture, we kind of encourage showing emotion more. So then what you might see is that a baby that's been raised by individualistic parents in an individualistic culture might show more emotion, both negative emotion and positive emotion, than a baby that's been raised in a collectivist culture. So they do take their clues about how to respond from the people around them. They're learning even at this very young age. So what about other people's emotions? We're talking about feeling what you feel, but also being able to understand what other people feel and to use that to help build up a relationship. Well, it talks about 4 to 6 month olds can differentiate between happiness, sadness, and fear, and it makes sense. It makes sense for babies to be able to pick up on the emotions of others because that could be protective for them. Like for example, I have a young one who looks to his older siblings, well, they're happy, so I'm happy. If my older kids are giggling, my baby starts giggling too. But if something is wrong, if there's some reason to be upset or distressed, then they're going to look to the people around them to figure out that they need to be upset or distressed. So that's kind of what we're talking about with this social referring here, referencing. So they will remember, as they get older, the emotional reactions of their parents. And so, for example, if you're freaked out by insects, and you squeal and run away when there's an insect, your child will learn to squeal and run away when there's an insect, right? Because they're learning that from you. Even if they don't understand why they're doing it, they're modeling that. So then they might even use adult behaviors and adult reactions to then make decisions about their own behaviors as they get older. So kids learn from watching you how to react. What if someone is crying? How does mom react when someone else in the environment is crying? And then child says, okay, well, that's the right thing to do when somebody else is crying. Well, they're learning by watching the people around them. Something else they're going to learn from you is how to regulate their emotions. So it is a very important skill to be able to control what you're feeling and to communicate this. And this is going to be correlated with health, with mental health, right? So very young children start to try to regulate their emotions. If something scares them, they'll try to get away from it. That's a very simple way of regulating your emotions, but trying to avoid the things that upset you. Try to avoid the thing that disgusts you, and then they go gravitate towards the things that make them happy. Because they're not really capable of any other more complex ways of regulating their emotions at this very young age. But they're going to learn by watching you, how you regulate your emotions. So it's a good idea sometimes to experience your emotions in front of your kids. Not always, not completely. Don't let them see everything you're feeling. But be like, okay, well, I am sad. And now this is what I do when I'm sad to help me feel better. Once again, though, be cautious. We want to model good coping skills. We don't want to model coping skills that we don't want our kids to gain, right? But kids are going to learn from us how to handle emotions. So what about play? During infancy and early childhood, this is where we start to interact with peers a little bit. And so very young children will smile at each other, giggle, point at each other. They are aware that another baby is in the room. As they get older, they can start engaging in what we call parallel play. The idea that I'm playing over here and you're playing over there, but I'm paying some attention to you. I'm watching what you're doing a little bit. I care just a little about what you're doing. And then as they get older, they involve each other more and more. So maybe we're going to do the same activity next to each other. Like we're both playing with Play-Doh, and we're going to sit next to each other and do the same activity. And maybe even interact with each other some, talk, smile, offer suggestions a little bit, you know how very young children do. But then as they get older, they're able to take on more cooperative tasks. So let's play a game. Let's maybe role play. I'm going to be this particular character. I'm trying, for some reason, my mind has gone blank on cartoons. But I'm going to be this particular character. You be that character, and we'll play together. Even with kids that they don't know very well. I think it's always really fun and encouraging to watch kids who don't know each other at all become best friends, you know, even just for an afternoon because they're at Chick-fil-A playing at the same time, that kind of thing. I think that's really encouraging that kids are able to do that. It would be great if adults could be that understanding as well. All right, so if we're talking about play, then we need to bring up make-believe. So using your imagination, this is also something that varies from child to child. Some kids are a little bit more practical. Some kids are a little bit more imaginative. One thing that we'll see is that kids will use imagination to help them process what they're being exposed to in real life. So it talks about values and traditions. So they will play what is exposed to them. So, you know, when I teach my kids about sharks, they're wanting to pretend that they're diving with sharks, right? So whatever they are learning about, whatever they hear, that's what they're going to practice. You know, they want to be superheroes. They want to be whatever they want to be at the time. And they are learning to express themselves that way. And also to explore frightening topics. I talk about my kids pretending that they're diving with sharks. That should be a frightening topic, but I don't know that we completely understand because we think swimming with sharks would be very cool right now. But they can start to explore the things that scare them a little bit in a safe way through make-believe. And so then you ask the question, what about imaginary playmates? Sometimes we have an imaginary friend and then we worry because we have all these different social norms about, okay, people, we shouldn't be talking about seeing something that's not really there, and we worry about that. Actually, imaginary friends, it's not really a problem usually. During this particular age range, it's very normal. It's associated with good outcomes, so it's not necessarily something to be worried about unless they are much older, or unless their imaginary playmate is doing something that hurts them. Okay, that could be them expressing some abuse situation, that kind of thing. But for the most part, imaginary playmates are a good thing. Nothing wrong with that. Preschoolers enjoy pretend play, which could involve pretend playmates as well. So there is a fine line between pretending and reality, and sometimes very young children don't understand what is make-believe and what is reality, but as they get older, they'll start to understand. So then carrying on with things that can cause concern, what about solitary play? What about the child that likes to play by themselves? This is once again a temperament thing, personality thing. Some kids are just more introverted. They enjoy spending time by themselves. They can be kind of overstimulated by spending too much time around other people. And this is true of adults as well. Usually solitary play is not a problem as long as the child is capable of engaging in some social play and has a desire to engage in some social play at some point. The child doesn't have to always want to play with other kids, as long as they want to play with other kids sometimes. But what happens if we see that a child maybe wants to play with others, but they're not really sure how to play with others? And so it talks about them wandering aimlessly, not really doing anything, kind of just wandering around or hovering over others. There could be some anxiety here that is keeping them from engaging in relationships. Maybe they don't know how to start the conversation, don't know how to develop a friendship. So if you're concerned, you can always talk to a child's pediatrician. Usually this is okay, but you might pick up on some warning signs of something like anxiety or maybe even something on an autism spectrum disorder range if there's some social issues here early on that seem significant. But usually not an issue. What about gender differences in play? So we see that young children usually prefer to play with peers that are the same sex as themselves. So girls want to play with girls, boys want to play with boys. And maybe this is because boys are playing games that appeal to other boys. girls are playing games that appeal to other girls. It talks about boys being more likely to have competitive games or maybe rough and tumble. So the boys want to play foosball and football, want to shoot Nerf guns at each other. Girls, on the other hand, tend to play games that are a little bit more cooperative, so we're working together, not competing against each other, but working together, and usually involve more conversation. Now, we ask the question, is this nature or is this nurture? It's usually a combination of both, probably. On the one hand, and we'll talk about this coming up, potentially there is some environmental influences of this is the way girls play, and so parents encourage that. But then it also could be some nature, some biology that's involved there as well, probably some of both. We see that girls tend to spend more time talking, tend to do a little bit better on verbal tasks, but then even that could be nature or nurture. When we're talking about prosocial behavior and girls being a little bit more likely to engage in prosocial behavior, but we're talking about behaviors that benefits other people, not just thinking about ourselves. Now, I have mentioned that we live in an individualistic society, so this may be something that's not as common in our culture as it is in other cultures, but children learn from an early age to recognize distress in other people and may try to find a way to comfort them, and they may not know how to comfort them, but they will often try to find a way to make somebody else feel better. And this could be a peer, this could be a parent, or whatever. I can remember at one point I was just having a rough day. You know, you guys ever just have a rough day? And my kids were, this was several years ago, my kids were off playing, and I went and sat down by the washing machine and cried because that was the place I thought nobody would find me. But sure enough, my son came and found me, and I don't know how old he was. He was probably 3 or 4, something like that. Anyway, he saw me crying, and he went and got one of his t-shirts and came back and wiped my tears with his t-shirt. And he's like, "Mom, it's all better now. The tears are gone, so you're all better." And of course, that kind of thing is just so incredibly sweet that you remember that. Kids will learn to try to meet other people's needs, to take care of other people to a certain extent, but they need to have this modeled for them. So if you spend any time around kids, thinking about other people is not always their wheelhouse. It's not always something that comes naturally to them. I think we have to learn some self-control and some restraint to think about other people before we do ourselves. And so we should model this for our kids, starting by loving them and taking care of them, and then letting them see you taking care of other people as well. Now, something that's important to be able to engage in this prosocial altruistic behavior, thinking about other people first, is being able to take their perspective. So it talks about having an accurate perception of someone else's viewpoint, that their viewpoint is different from yours, and that their situation is different from yours. So then thinking about how is that person feeling, and how can I help that person feel better? That involves empathy. And empathy does not come naturally to everyone. We want to try to encourage our kids to think about things from someone else's perspective. So if one child hits another child after they go in timeout or whatever, we have a punishment, and then we need to say, why was it not okay for you to hit that person? And the child might say, well, because hitting is against the rules. Well, okay, yes, hitting is against the rules, but don't leave it there. Why is hitting against the rules? How do you think it made that person feel to have you hit them? So helping them to try to start practicing taking someone else's perspective and feeling what they're feeling, empathy here, can then make them more likely to engage in this behavior later because they've practiced understanding what other people are feeling and knowing that other people may be feeling something different from what they're feeling. So we want our children to engage in prosocial behavior. We don't want them to be selfish and always thinking about themselves. So as parents, then, we need to model prosocial behavior. As I said, we need to be prosocial towards our kids. We need to take care of our kids and also have them see us taking care of other people as well. In addition, as I said, also disciplining warmly and supportively. So letting kids know why their behavior is wrong. Consistency. Remember, authoritative parenting. High on affection, high on discipline. We have rules. When we break the rules, we're punished for those rules in an appropriate way, in a safe way. And then we make sure that kids understand why that behavior was not allowed and how it impacts other people. Not just because it's against the rules, but because we hurt someone else. So using reason Now, I know reasoning with a 2-year-old is very challenging, but start early and practice with them, explaining to them why that is against the rules and how it makes someone else feel. And giving kids opportunities to get kids involved in making cards for other people or bake cookies to take to the firefighters, that kind of thing. Give them opportunities to practice these skills that they're learning. Okay, so something else that we are learning that is related to our relationships would be social norms. They're called social roles. Here we're talking about the same thing. These are cultural guidelines as to what is okay and what's not okay in our behaviors, in the words that we use, in the way that we treat other people, in the way that we dress, pretty much anything, social norms. And we have social norms for men and women. And I'm sure you can think of examples of this. We expect women to be nurturing, to be emotional, to communicate. We expect men to be more stoic and brave and strong and all of that. We have these social norms. Well, very young children start to learn these social norms, and they start to understand them at a pretty early age. So it talks about at around 18 months, boys and girls looking longer at gender stereotyped pictures of toys. So there are some toys that we might consider gender neutral, but then there are some toys that are labeled more like those are toys for boys to play with, you know, trucks or whatever. And these are toys, dolls, toys for girls to play with, that kind of thing. So from a very early age, kids do tend to choose to play with and look longer at toys that are associated with their gender. But this may be nature, it could be nurture as well. As they get older, they pick up on, even if you've not directly taught them, this is how boys act and this is how girls act, they pick up on it. Kids are more clever sometimes than we give them credit for. And so they learn those social norms from watching other people and from watching TV and from watching peers and that kind of thing. So then they are probably going to start engaging in behaviors and traits that they think are more appropriate based on those social norms. So then we ask ourselves the question, how are boys and girls different when it comes to ability levels, psychologically? There's a lot we could say here. Usually when you set out to do research on gender differences, you don't usually find large differences. And the differences that we do find are usually not very large, even if we do find a difference here. But just a few examples that are listed here. So girls are more likely to score higher than boys on tasks related to verbal ability, whereas boys tend to do better on mathematics, spatial ability. When it talks about memory, it depends on memory for what. You know, phonological memory is going to be probably better in girls, whereas spatial memory, following directions, that kind of thing, is better in boys. Now, why is this? Is this because it's something that's biological, it's part of your brain? Brain is different. Possibly, but also probably has a lot to do with our culture. Like verbal ability, for example, we reinforce girls for talking. We talk more to girls. We expect girls to talk to each other, but we don't always reinforce that in boys. So maybe boys don't have a chance to learn that as much. On the other hand, we tend to have this self-fulfilling prophecy, which means you believe something is true and therefore you engage in behaviors that make it true. Where we think boys are going to be better at math, therefore maybe we spend more time teaching math to boys, and then they do become better at math. So just a few things that are listed here. When it talks about aggression, aggression is not always physical, even if that's what comes to mind usually. Aggression is just behavior that's intended to harm another person. So boys are more likely to engage in physical aggression. Girls are more likely to engage in more like relational aggression, so rumors and gossip and that kind of thing. We often see girls being a little bit more emotionally sensitive. Once again, is this because we've encouraged this, because we've taught this? Possibly. And then when it talks about effortful control, things like impulse issues, behavioral issues, something like ADHD is diagnosed more in boys, and we see this issue more in boys. And that could be because the way that girls experience ADHD is different, that girls are more likely to have the inattentive type, whereas boys are more likely to have the hyperactive type, and so maybe we're missing it in girls because it's not as obvious. But these are just a few differences that we find between boys and girls. We are seeing that parents today are more likely to parent similarly, and research says this is especially true for moms. Moms are more likely to parent sons and daughters pretty similarly. Usually, if there is a difference, it's dads that treat sons and daughters differently. So we do tend to, today we're making strides towards having more similar parenting between boys and girls. But we do see that parents tend to differentially reinforce appropriate behaviors. So, for example, we tend to ignore or maybe punish behaviors that we consider inappropriate and reinforce the behaviors that we consider appropriate. And that can be based on like gender roles, social norms, that kind of thing. Which supports that social learning theory, the idea that you look to the most relevant person in your world and model that person's behavior. So a little girl may model mom, a little boy may model dad. There's some research to suggest that parents oftentimes, they see their kids learning gender stereotypes and then oftentimes just kind of let that go, don't usually contradict or question that. But very young children are learning their gender roles from parents, but as they get older and start interacting with peers more, then they start to learn things from their peers as well. And then there's a debate about exactly at what point peers become more influential than parents, and that depends on the situation, but certainly they do play a role in people's behaviors. So why do we see differences in boys and girls? We've talked a lot about nurture, a lot about parenting and culture that can cause differences. But we can also say that there may be a nature side of things, biological influences here. So it talks about evolution, the evolutionary theory here, the idea that men and women have different reproductive dilemmas. Evolutionary psychology says it's all about making babies, whether you realize it or not. That as a species, we need to continue to reproduce to pass on our genetics. And so men and women have different reproductive situations, which can then lead to different behaviors. This will probably come back up later when we talk about relationships in adulthood. But you can see that because women are the ones who actually give birth to children, then something like nurturing might be a little bit more important for them. On the other hand, men are not able to do that, and so something like provision in other ways might be something that makes sense for men. And so then this could be related to the role that we play in reproduction as far as what types of behaviors are adaptive, appropriate. So other research here that suggests that it could potentially be nature, not just nurture. Identical twins tend to be more similar in a lot of areas, but especially in their preference for sex-typical toys and activities. Now, when we say identical twins, we're talking about one egg, one sperm that's split into two, so then basically genetically identical, very similar. And so with fraternal twins, you have two eggs, two sperm, so they are no more genetically alike than any other sibling pair. And so identical twins being more alike in something than fraternal twins, it really emphasizes the role of nature, the role of genetics here. And so there could be a genetic predisposition towards certain personality types that then could be associated with certain activities, that kind of thing. One other thing to note is that in utero testosterone exposure can predict preference for certain activities that we consider more stereotypically masculine. It talks about in utero testosterone. So one thing to note is that women do have testosterone and men do have estrogen. It's just that women tend to have more estrogen, men tend to have more testosterone. But exposure to higher levels of testosterone, both for male or female in utero, tends to be associated, this is just correlation of course, associated with preference for masculine type activities. Alright, so that is the end of this set of slides. So during our next video, we will start talking about kind of middle childhood. So we'll talk about physical and cognitive issues related to middle childhood. Don't forget that you do have activity 4, and I will talk to you guys during the next video. Just let me know if you need anything. You guys have a great day.